Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into something pretty intense. We're looking at controversies and corruption, specifically around Australia's Liberal National Party, the LNP.
Ah, yes.
And we've got a really interesting mix of sources for this one. We've got articles that list out, like, a crazy number of controversies, some historical deep dives on specific incidents,
Yeah.
and even a rundown of some of the politicians who are facing these misconduct claims.
Sounds like a lot to unpack.
It is. It is a lot.
Yeah.
So, when you look at it, the first thing that kind of hits you is just the sheer volume of it. It's not just like a couple of little oopsies here and there.
Right.
We're talking like a pattern of behavior.
Yeah, and I think that's what's most alarming. When you start to see so many instances, it really makes you wonder if this is just a series of unfortunate events or if there's something more systemic going on within the party.
Yeah. I mean, the Chaser, for example, they have this list of 124 LNP controversies
Wow.
just in the last 7 years.
That's a lot.
It's a ton. And then you have New Politics, which actually compares the current era to the Rum Corps period.
Oh, wow.
Which, if you know your Australian history, that's not a good comparison.
Not at all. That was a time of rampant corruption, and to be compared to that is pretty concerning. It suggests a real disregard for ethical boundaries.
Yeah. So let's maybe jump into some specifics.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Because like I said, the Chaser list has like 124 things on it, so we can't go through all of them.
Right.
But they have things like, cutting funding to the National Audit Office right after it uncovered wasteful spending, ignoring rulings of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and even forging documents to discredit political opponents. I mean, this is serious stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, those are really serious allegations. If true, it really suggests a lack of accountability and transparency, which, those are kind of the pillars of a functioning democracy. So it's pretty worrying.
Right. And then you also have some pretty significant environmental implications, like with Angus Taylor.
Oh, right. The energy minister.
Yeah, he was allegedly involved in the illegal poisoning of endangered grasslands.
Yeah, that was a big one. And what's particularly concerning about that case is that Taylor and his brother reportedly had a financial stake in the property where the poisoning happened.
Oh, wow.
So it raises some serious questions about conflict of interest, whether personal gain was put ahead of protecting the environment, and also, obviously, the rule of law.
Yeah. And then there's the Barnaby Joyce situation.
Right, the former deputy prime minister.
Yeah. He approved this $80 million water buyback deal, and it benefited a company that was registered in the Cayman Islands.
Oh, the Cayman Islands. That's a bit of a red flag, isn't it? Known for being a tax haven.
Yeah. And the connections in that deal are really interesting because the company, Eastern Australia Agriculture, they had Angus Taylor, again, now the energy minister. He was a former director of that company.
Interesting. So he pops up again.
He does. And a close associate of Taylor's was one of the main beneficiaries.
So you've got this situation where water rights were sold, potentially at an inflated price, benefiting people connected to a government minister.
Yeah.
And the whole thing just lacks transparency. It just makes you wonder where the public funds are actually going and if they're being used properly.
And then we have the whole thing with the au pair visas.
Oh, right, with Peter Dutton.
Yeah, the Home Affairs Minister at the time. He intervened to grant visas to au pairs who were connected to political donors.
Even though they didn't meet the requirements.
Even though they didn't meet the requirements.
That sounds like a clear case of favoritism. And it just reinforces this idea that political connections, maybe even personal gain, are being prioritized over due process and ethical considerations.
Yeah. And then speaking of potential favoritism, there's the issue of media manipulation.
Oh, right. How does that play into all of this?
Well, there was this $30 million grant given to Murdoch's Foxtel, specifically to promote women's sport.
Okay. Sounds good on the surface.
Yeah. But there's been very little transparency on how that money was actually used.
Ah, I see. So again, it's this lack of transparency that raises those red flags. You've got this large sum of public money going somewhere, but no one really knows how it's being used or if it's achieving its intended purpose.
Yeah. And then when we're talking about public trust, there's the Lindsay pamphlet scandal.
Oh, yes. During the 2007 election, right?
Right. And this is where Liberal Party volunteers, they distributed fake pamphlets, and these were specifically designed to mislead voters within the Muslim community.
That's awful. Targeting a specific religious group like that and trying to exploit their anxieties for political gain, that's a new low. It really makes you question the integrity of those involved.
And New Politics actually mentions that this wasn't an isolated incident.
Really?
Yeah. They talk about other instances where the LNP allegedly used similar misleading tactics, like fake how-to-vote cards and signage designed to misdirect voters, particularly in Chinese communities.
So it wasn't just a one-off mistake. It seems like there might be a pattern of behavior here, a deliberate strategy to manipulate elections by preying on vulnerable communities.
Yeah. So we've got financial stuff, environmental concerns, and potential election interference. And, this all happened, or a lot of it happened, under Scott Morrison's leadership.
Right. He was prime minister from 2018 to 2022. How did all of this play out during his time in office?
Well, he came into power on this wave of popularity.
Okay.
But, as time went on, people started criticizing him more and more.
What were the main criticisms?
His handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, his climate change policies, and how he dealt with women in the workplace, all of that drew a lot of criticism.
Yeah, those were some pretty contentious issues during his time. And let's not forget the string of scandals that followed his surprise election win in 2019.
Right. There were the secret ministerial appointments, those accusations of bullying, and of course those leaked text messages.
Oh, yes, the infamous leaked texts. What a mess that was.
Yeah. I mean, some of those texts revealed some pretty unflattering opinions about him from his own colleagues. Like, you had then Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce
Yeah.
calling him a hypocrite and a liar.
Ouch. That's gotta hurt. It's interesting because one of our sources, Scott Morrison, Rise and Fall, talks about how he was initially praised for his competence, his communication skills, especially when he was treasurer. So it seems like maybe the prime ministership either changed him or maybe revealed something that was already there.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, how much does pressure and power change a person? And then there's the whole fallout from the Brittany Higgins allegations.
Right. That really brought to light the treatment of women within Parliament and how the Morrison government handled sexual assault complaints.
Yeah. And the report that came out afterwards that found rampant sexual harassment within Parliament, that was pretty damning. It seemed like a deeply ingrained cultural issue that had been ignored or downplayed for years. So we've covered a lot here. We've got financial dealings, environmental concerns, election tactics, and these deeply concerning issues within Parliament itself. But what does all of this mean for Australian politics? What's the impact of all these controversies on public trust and democracy in general?
That's the real question, isn't it? And it's a complex one. You have this long list of questionable actions by the LNP, but at the same time, voters keep electing them.
Yeah, it's almost like a paradox.
It is, and I think it speaks to a larger issue of accountability, or maybe a lack thereof, in Australian politics.
So how do we make sense of that? Why do people keep voting for the LNP despite all of this?
Well, part of it could be the LNP's messaging, their ability to control the narrative, and their close relationship with certain media outlets certainly doesn't hurt.
You're talking about the right-wing media, the outlets that tend to support the LNP and often downplay these scandals.
Exactly. When you have a significant portion of the media consistently defending a particular party and minimizing their missteps, it creates an echo chamber where dissenting voices are drowned out. It makes it difficult for alternative viewpoints to gain traction.
But what about investigative journalism? They're out there digging for the truth, aren't they?
They are, and they play a crucial role in uncovering wrongdoing and holding those in power accountable. But they often face an uphill battle. They're up against powerful forces that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo.
So it's like a David and Goliath situation where investigative journalists are trying to expose the truth, but they're facing immense pressure and resistance.
It's a pretty accurate analogy, and it's important to remember that the impact of these controversies goes beyond just politics. They erode public trust in institutions, create cynicism, and can even lead to people becoming apathetic and disengaged from civic life.
That's a scary thought. What happens when people lose faith in their government and the system as a whole?
It creates a dangerous void where misinformation and extremism can thrive. When people feel like their voices aren't being heard, they may become more susceptible to radical ideologies that offer simplistic solutions to complex problems.
So these LNP controversies, they're not just isolated incidents. They have the potential to undermine Australian democracy itself.
Exactly. They highlight a need for greater transparency, accountability, and a renewed focus on ethical conduct in Australian politics.
Okay, so we've talked about the broad strokes, but let's get a bit more specific. Our source, list of Australian politicians facing claims of misconduct, Name some pretty high-profile LNP figures.
It's a pretty extensive list, and it really underscores the point that these issues go beyond just a few bad apples. They potentially reach the highest levels of government.
So where do we even begin?
Well, a logical starting point would be former Prime Minister Scott Morrison himself. As we've already discussed, his time in office was marked by several controversies. The secret ministerial appointments, his handling of the Brittany Higgins allegations, it all contributed to a growing sense of unease about his leadership.
And then there's Gladys Berejiklian, the former Premier of New South Wales. She resigned in the middle of an ICAC investigation.
Right, the investigation into whether she abused her power by giving funding to projects that could have benefited her secret partner, former MP Daryl Maguire.
It just goes to show how important transparency is and avoiding even the appearance of conflicts of interest.
Absolutely. Secrecy breeds suspicion, and when those in power operate in the shadows, it's much easier for misconduct to occur.
And then we have John Barilaro, the former Deputy Premier of New South Wales.
Ah, yes. The controversy surrounding his appointment to that lucrative trade commissioner role in New York.
That whole thing really didn't look good. There were allegations of political favoritism. It just seemed like another example of someone using their position for personal gain.
And of course, let's not forget the incident where he was charged with assault and malicious damage after he attacked a photographer.
Yeah, that was a pretty public and embarrassing episode. It raised serious concerns about his judgment and temperament. I mean, it seems like every time you turn around, there's another scandal brewing.
It can be overwhelming, the sheer number of controversies, but it's important not to become desensitized to these issues. We need to stay informed, hold our leaders accountable, and demand better from those who represent us.
It's a lot to take in, but you're absolutely right. We can't just throw our hands up and say, well, that's politics.
Exactly. Apathy is the enemy of progress. We need to stay engaged and work towards a system where integrity and accountability are the norm, not the exception.
Maybe we can learn from these past mistakes and create a future where those in power are genuinely committed to serving the public good.
That's the hope, isn't it? That through scrutiny, dialogue, and a commitment to ethical conduct, we can rebuild trust and create a more just society.
Yeah, it really is. It kind of makes you think, even if you hold individuals accountable, is that enough?
Right?
Or do we need to, look at the system itself?
Yeah, like are there systemic changes that could actually prevent these situations from happening again?
Exactly. And I think there are a few things that come to mind.
Okay, like what?
Well, for starters, strengthening campaign finance laws. Trying to limit the influence of those big special interest groups.
Okay.
Because the more transparent that money trail is in politics, the harder it is to hide those shady dealings.
Makes sense. Less opportunity for corruption.
Exactly. And then another thing is greater transparency in government decision-making, like making those processes more open to the public.
So people can see what's actually going on behind the scenes.
Right. Because when those decisions are made out in the open, it's less likely that someone's going to make a choice that only benefits them, or their buddies. Yeah, it's harder to be corrupt when everyone's watching.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the issue of consequences.
Right.
Because if people in power can just get away with this stuff over and over again,
It just keeps happening.
it just keeps happening. You need to break that cycle.
So how do we do that?
Well, I think it takes a multifaceted approach. You need a strong, independent media that's not afraid to hold people accountable.
Okay.
You need citizens who are engaged and demand transparency.
Yeah.
And you need a political system that actually puts integrity first, not just partisan interests.
So basically, a complete overhaul of the political culture.
Well, it's not going to be easy, but I think it's possible.
I hope you're right. So we've talked about the system, but let's get back to those individuals.
Okay.
That list of politicians facing misconduct claims, it's a who's who of the LNP.
It really is. And it shows how deep these issues run.
So let's talk about some more of those names. Scott Morrison, we've already mentioned him.
Right. Secret ministries, the Brittany Higgins case, all of that really tarnished his reputation.
Yeah. And then you have Gladys Berejiklian.
The former premier of New South Wales.
Yeah. The ICIC investigation, her relationship with Daryl Maguire, all of that raised serious concerns about conflicts of interest.
Absolutely. And it shows how personal relationships can really cloud judgment in those positions of power.
And then John Barilaro.
Oh, yes. The trade commissioner appointment, the assault charges.
That whole thing was a mess. It made people question whether those in charge were really acting in the best interests of the public.
And unfortunately, the list goes on. Stuart Ayres, Linda Reynolds, they're all implicated in some way.
It's a lot to take in. And honestly, it can be pretty discouraging. What would you say to people who are listening to all of this and feeling disillusioned, like maybe they're losing faith in the system?
Well, first of all, I completely understand that feeling. It's easy to feel powerless when you see all of this happening.
Right.
But I would say don't give up. Don't let cynicism win. Because we, as citizens, we have a role to play in making things better.
So what can we do? Like, as individuals, how can we make a difference?
Well, first, stay informed. Educate yourself about the issues, follow the news,
Yeah.
because knowledge is power. The more you know, the better equipped you are to make those judgments, to hold people accountable.
Don't just stick your head in the sand and hope it goes away.
Exactly, and get involved.
Okay.
Talk to
Yeah.
people, have those conversations about what's happening. Support organizations that are fighting for transparency and accountability.
Use your voice.
Exactly. And most importantly, use your vote.
So what about the LNP? Can they come back from all of this? Can they regain the public's trust?
I think that's the big question, right? It's hard to say for sure, but I think they're at a crossroads.
Okay.
They can choose to acknowledge these problems, make some real changes, and try to rebuild that trust.
Okay.
Or they can keep denying, deflecting, and just make things worse.
So their future really depends on the choices they make from here on out.
I think so. And those choices have big implications, not just for the LNP, but for Australian politics as a whole.
Well, listener, we spent a lot of time talking about the problems.
We have.
But let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about solutions. How can we actually fix this? What needs to happen for people to trust the system again?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's a complex one,
Right.
but I think we need to address both the symptoms and the underlying causes.
Okay, so starting with the symptoms, what are some things we can do right now to address these concerns about corruption and misconduct?
Well, one thing is to strengthen those oversight mechanisms, like the National Audit Office, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal.
Okay.
Make sure they have the resources they need to do their jobs effectively.
So they can actually hold people accountable.
Exactly. And we need more transparency in government decision-making.
Right. Open things up, make it harder to hide what's going on.
Right. And campaign finance reform is crucial.
Okay, yeah. Less influence from those big donors, more transparency about where the money is coming from.
Exactly. It's about minimizing those opportunities for corruption.
So if the system makes it harder to be corrupt, then people are less likely to try.
That's the idea. But like I said, that's just addressing the symptoms. We also need to look at the root causes.
Okay, so what are those?
Well, I think we need to cultivate a stronger sense of public service, among politicians, among public servants.
Yeah.
Like really emphasize ethics, transparency, accountability.
So a real cultural shift, moving away from self-interest and toward actually serving the public good.
Exactly. And along with that, we need systemic reforms that address those power imbalances, strengthen whistleblower protections, empower those independent oversight bodies, and reform electoral systems to reduce the influence of money.
It sounds like a pretty big undertaking.
It is. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's necessary.
So it's not just about catching the bad guys. It's about changing the system so that it's harder for them to exist in the first place.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay. Well, listener, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. But before we wrap things up, I want to go back to that list of politicians facing misconduct claims.
Okay.
Because there are a few more names on there that I think are worth discussing. And they really highlight the need for continued scrutiny and accountability. Okay, so one of the names that really jumps out is Christian Porter.
Right, the former attorney general.
Yeah. He had that historical rape allegation against him, which he strongly denied, but it really put him under a lot of pressure.
It did. And it ultimately led to his resignation from cabinet. That case really sparked a national conversation, about how we handle these kinds of allegations, especially when they involve people in positions of power. There were questions about due process, the presumption of innocence, and how do you even address historical allegations when the evidence might be limited?
Yeah. And it made it clear that we need a really strong, independent process for investigating these things.
Absolutely. A process that's fair to everyone involved.
Right, both the accuser and the accused.
Exactly. And I think it also highlighted the need for a cultural shift, particularly in places like Parliament, in how we address sexual assault allegations.
Then there's Alan Tudge.
The former education minister.
Yeah, he was accused of emotional and psychological abuse by Rochelle Miller.
Right, a former staffer who he had an affair with.
That case really brought up a lot of concerns about the workplace culture in Parliament.
It did. And the power dynamics between ministers and their staff.
Like, are there proper safeguards in place? Are complaints of bullying and harassment taken seriously?
It made people question those things, for sure. And it's a reminder that misconduct, it's not always about money or corruption.
Right. It can be about abuse of power in all sorts of ways.
Exactly. And we need to create a culture where any kind of misconduct is taken seriously.
Okay. And then there's Bridget McKenzie.
Oh, yes. The former sports minister.
She resigned over the whole sports warts scandal.
Right, where she was giving out sports grants to marginal electorates right before the 2019 election.
Pretty much just trying to buy votes, right?
It certainly looked that way, and it really raised concerns about whether public funds were being used for political gain.
Yeah. It made people question the whole system. Like, is taxpayer money being used responsibly? Or is it just a tool for politicians to get ahead?
And when people start to lose faith in the government's ability to spend money wisely, that's a real problem.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of individual cases. But zooming out a bit, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to remember from all of this?
Well, I think the big picture is that these controversies, they're not just about a few bad apples.
Right.
They might point to a bigger problem
With
with the culture of the LNP, maybe even Australian politics as a whole.
So it's not enough to just punish the individuals. We need to look at the system that allowed this to happen.
Exactly. We need to think about what kind of political culture we're creating. What message are we sending to people who want to be in power?
Are we rewarding integrity and accountability? Or are we turning a blind eye to self-interest and partisan politics?
Those are tough questions, but they're questions that we all need to be asking.
Because ultimately, it's up to us, the citizens, to demand better.
Absolutely. We need to hold our leaders accountable. We need to advocate for reforms that strengthen our democracy.
So listener, that's our deep dive into LNP controversies. It's been a heavy topic,
It has.
but we hope you found it informative. And we encourage you to keep digging into these issues. We've included links to all of our sources in the show notes and some suggestions for further reading.
Because the more you know, the more empowered you are to make a difference.
That's right. So until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.